My name is Melissa Shackelford, and I serve as a program curator at Upper House, where we explore the life of the mind and the questions of the soul from a Christian perspective, acknowledging our need for holistic integration of body, mind, soul, and spirit. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Not Unprecedented, Learning from the Literature of Plagues and Epidemics with Marilyn McEntyre. This afternoon, we are gathering in a Zoom meeting format, so Marilyn can see you face to face as she's greatly hoped to be with us in person today. If you're willing, I would like to invite you to turn on your camera, but please leave your mic muted. Also, I recommend selecting presenter mode at the top of at the right of your screen for optimal viewing. During the presentation, I would like to invite you to submit your questions for Marilyn into the chat, preceded by a Q:, so we can easily identify them during the Q&A time at the end of her talk. As a professor of medical humanities at the UC Berkeley-UCSF Joint Medical Program, Marilyn McEntyre is well familiar with the intersection of medicine and human culture, and happened to be teaching a class on the literature of plagues and epidemics as we entered our journey with COVID-19 in March of this year here in the US. The questions she posed to her students studying classic texts have become abruptly relevant. For example, how have plagues, epidemics resituated the church and community life? How does the medical problem of containment become a legal problem? And what theological problems do plagues and epidemics pose? How do they raise the predicament of competing moral principles? Well, today, award-winning author of several books on language and faith, Marilyn McEntyre's teaching and writing has ranged widely for college students, seminarians, medical students, and adult learners for many years. Today, she will examine the narratives of the past to help us make sense of the narrative we're living and creating today. Marilyn, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Melissa. What a pleasure to be here. And it's nice to see some people I know and many that I don't. It's kind of fun to see your faces. I have really enjoyed teaching the medicine in literature courses over the years. I think that exploring the cultural dimensions of medicine and especially the role of language and story in medical practice is something that can help both practitioners and patients make better use of clinical encounters and really begin to understand how the phenomenon of disease shapes our political life, our shared life, and even life in the church. So the focus I wanted to take today with you was how tales of plagues and pandemics might help us now. Why might this be a time to dive back into some of the literature that's available? There's a lot of it. One of the things I try to call attention to in my courses is how these stories are told and by whom and for what purposes. It's always an interesting thing to ask about stories, but especially these stories. What are some of the difficulties posed by these big public health phenomena, a public health crisis, and why is it hard to get a narrative handle on what's happening? I'm going to draw my examples from Western literature because that's where a lot of my work has been, but I do want to acknowledge that obviously plagues and epidemics, pandemics are worldwide. There is a significant body of Western literature on this, but I'm increasingly interested in looking at the literature that comes out of, for instance, malaria or smallpox or some of the things that other nations have dealt with longer than we have. Just to remind you of some of the examples, you'll recognize most of these. There are over 100 references to plagues in the Bible. Those include frequent references to leprosy. And of course, my course goes all the way back to Exodus and the judgments on the various Egyptian gods that are implied in the Exodus plague stories. The Iliad opens with a plague. Oedipus opens with a plague. The Black Plague in the 14th century is the context and the pretext of Boccaccio's Decameron. and the introduction to the Decameron is sort of a classic piece of plague literature where the narrator goes into long, excruciating detail about what's going on in Florence as he's speaking to and introducing the stories told by a number of people who have escaped the plague. And in a way, it's an indictment of them and their flight from Florence. The 11th book of Milton's Paradise Lost is a plague-ridden version of the Old Testament where Saint Michael looks out upon humankind and looks at all the history of plagues and epidemics that have been effectively God's judgment on humankind. The central event in Alessandro Manzoni's beautiful Italian novel, it's the great 19th century novel to come out of Italy, The Betrothed, is a kind of standalone 2-chapter representation of the plague in Milan. It's a beautiful piece, and it's really a kind of classic step-by-step representation of what tends to happen in times of plague. Many of you know Poe's story, The Masque of the Red Death, which is about people sequestering themselves in flight from a plague. Many of you may also know Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider. She borrows her title, of course, from the Book of Revelation, and that's one of the few stories to come out of the flu epidemic, the pandemic of 1918 to 1920. You're probably familiar with Camus' The Plague. You may or may not know Philip Roth's story, his novel Nemesis, that came out of the polio epidemic. He himself apparently got polio at one point as a kid. And then there were a number of things that came out of the AIDS epidemic. Larry Kramer's play, The Normal Heart, was one of them that I thought was quite powerful. And of course, movies like Philadelphia. And then more recently, of course, their plague literature continues, but when you just look at the range of films that have come out since the AIDS epidemic and since, say, Richard Preston wrote The Hot Zone about Ebola, the fear of a worldwide pandemic, which we're now seeing happen, emerges in films like Outbreak. They have these names, Outbreak. There's one called Contagion. There's one called Virus. And there's one called Infection. So the titles go on. So those are just a few pulled from this long tradition of plague literature, or epidemic literature. And here are some few things that these stories help us recognize. I'm just going to start with the common features. Epidemics take existing scientific and medical practices to a new learning edge. So a lot of these stories feature at some point a scientist or a doctor who is discovering things he doesn't know where to go with because we're out at a new edge. We don't know how to handle this. Epidemics and plagues open opportunity for innovation. That's another thing we learn from these stories, and certainly from history. For just to give you one gruesome example, after the Great Plague in London, apparently they didn't know what to do with all the bodies. So many people had died, so they started chucking them in the river, which at some points made the river unnavigable. So what do we do with the dead? That becomes a very practical problem. Or some of you may be aware of the Ghost Map, which is a beautifully told nonfiction narrative about John Snow's discovery of the cause of cholera. And that opens with a description of the sewage systems in London and the inadequate processing of sewage was causing multiple problems, but certainly this disease. And at the end of it, he says, if you come to London, you might want to see Big Ben and Westminster, but I would say that one of the great monuments of London is its sewage system. Because after Snow's introduction, they took a couple of decades and devised a whole new sewage system for London that even at that point had to work its way around some of the existing sewers and the Underground Railroad. So this whole emphasis on innovation and opportunity and real reframing of what culture depends on comes up in these stories. We also see in these stories that plagues always have significant economic effects, and they are always political events. So when you hear people talking about, oh, we've so politicized the epidemic, I think, well, yeah, that's true. We've politicized it in some very unfortunate ways, like the politicizing of mask wearing in this one. But the fact is, plagues and epidemics are always political events. First of all, there's something that are happening to everybody. And second of all, there are always problems about who gets treated and who gets paid and who goes out of business. All of this comes up. They redefine leadership, often because the leadership of the town or the city state flees. People who are rich leave because they can afford to go someplace and they have vacation homes. So what do the rest of us do? And in some of the earlier stories, like Manzoni's account of the plague in Milan in the 17th century, 16th century, the religious take over. And you know that historically, monks and nuns often ran the lazarettos, or the places where people would go to die. They would house people no one else even wanted to touch. So the positioning of the church relative to civic power in plagues often changes dramatically. They disrupt the class system for the same reason. People who are willing to stay take jobs that someone is willing to pay a lot for, like disposing or carrying dead bodies. There are also media events. And one of the questions that comes up in quite a number of plague stories, even the early ones, is who's going to tell this? And who has control of information? Who gets to know? Who has a right to tell the story? What kind of point of view or vantage point do they have on what's happening? They always invite theological reexamination and reflection. Some of you may remember that two of the kind of anchor points in Camus' novel, The Plague, are Father Panelou's sermon early on. It's a very harsh sermon about the punishments of God. And that certainly is a long theme that still has some purchase in theology in the public mind. But then toward the end of the novel, he preaches another sermon after he has watched a child die of the plague. And his heart is broken and his theology becomes more ambiguous. He finds himself in the gray area. He doesn't really know what to say. He's not so sure of himself. So this whole theme of how illness brings up theological reflection is important in not only that novel, but many others. Plagues and epidemics bring up a new awareness of our connectedness and our vulnerability. If I have time toward the end, I would love to read you a poem that was written in March by a Berkeley poet, Lynn Unger, just called Pandemic. But it focuses on how we are connected and how a pandemic gives us a whole new imagination for the both beautiful and terrifying ways we are connected, that we're in it together. So they pose moral and political challenges that bring out the best and the worst in us, and they make both of these visible in new ways. And apropos making visible, one of the words that we've heard along with this is unprecedented, which it isn't, is this is apocalyptic. I've heard the word apocalyptic more in the last few months than I've heard it for many years prior to that. I think partly many of us feel like we're in an apocalyptic moment because there's this perfect storm of convergence between the crisis of climate change and the political contentiousness that we're facing in this election year and the pandemic. So we get these layers of feeling that we have come to a crest of something. But I read a lovely piece not too long ago, just a reminder by a priest, that the word apocalyptic means to unveil or reveal. And this is another theme that plagues and epidemics reveal something to all of us that we need to see. They make us visible to ourselves in new and important ways. Well, To look at them from a literary point of view is to consider, why are these hard stories to tell? What is the challenge of finding a narrative mode for the story? One is that they're many-stranded and they're many-sided. So like war narratives, it's very difficult to know from what point of view you tell it. I love a passage in Tolstoy's War and Peace where Napoleon is looking down from a hill at the Battle of Austerlitz. And he has some reflections on what's going on, but it becomes apparent to the reader that he doesn't really know what's going on because he's standing up on that hill. So he can't really see the battle. Then it switches to Nikolai, who's in the middle of the battle, but he doesn't really know what's going on because all he can do is see the dust and the dying people and the horses falling over and the noise and the chaos. He doesn't even really know where it is. So you don't get an authoritative view of a battle from within it, and you don't get it from up on the hill either. And so the narrator in War and Peace kind of leaves the reader reflecting on, how do you know? How does any of us know exactly what the whole story is? And it's similar in a plague. So one of the interesting things that comes up in many of these plague stories is the fact that it's difficult to tell. In Manzoni's The Betrothed, the narrator keeps reminding you that he is a historian, as he says, and he has based the story he's telling on a lot of fragmentary information. And actually, Manzoni did collect a lot of fragmentary information. But so this narrator is constantly reminding you that he's not responsible for what he's telling because he's just patching it together from all the available records. But those records, he also reminds us, were kept by people for particular purposes. There's actually a new history of the United States I am very much enjoying by Jill Lepore, where she does a little bit of that. And I love when historians do this, when they remind you that history is made of whatever's available. And what's available was made by people who had access to literacy and to publication. And so there's a lot of the human record we don't get here. So we're going to do what we can with what we have. And you get that in these plague and epidemic stories too. It's really fascinating how important it seems to be to some of these writers to keep telling you that this is a hard story to write and that all you're getting is a fragment of the whole. The plagues have multiple epicenters too. If some of you may remember Randy Schilt's big compendious book that was written during the AIDS epidemic called And the Band Played On. And in that, he establishes New York and San Francisco as two epicenters of the AIDS epidemic in the US. And it's almost as though he's kind of playing out these ancient Greek archetypes of Troy and Athens. The two cities handled the epidemic in very different ways. And he kind of constructs these characters based on actual people who took different parts in the war. And the war metaphor is something we'll come back to later, but the notion that fighting a disease is like fighting war is really a deeply embedded cultural metaphor that deserves examination. But these stories remind us that there are multiple epicenters, multiple agendas, and that the story is inconclusive. They generally end before the plague is over. It's dwindling, but there isn't a day when the plague is over either. They go underground. They know it's going to come back. It'll come back in another form. And so that sense of indeterminacy or inconclusiveness is another interesting feature of a lot of these stories. Some of the practical questions that come up in the course of these accounts are these. One is the question of how disease spreads. It's worth remembering that germ theory wasn't actually articulated as such until the 1870s, although the notion of contamination and contagion had been around for centuries. People didn't really know how it happened, which is why the ghost map is so interesting, because the ghost map recounts Snow's discovery of the source of cholera in 1854. And at that time, the dominant theory of contagion was miasma theory, which is there's something floating around in the air, which of course in airborne diseases is true. But Snow's efforts to say, no, it's actually not the air, it's water. It's the water contamination that's causing this. One of the amazing things about that story is how much evidence he produced and how long it took people to accept that evidence. So one of the things we see in that story is the power of a dominant theory and the difficulty of the paradigm shift. For people to shift away from an explanation that seems adequate takes a lot of psychological resiliency and a lot of courage in some ways. So the fight within the medical community is one of the practical problems that rises over this question of how does disease spread? Who's getting it? And we see this, right, in the pandemic we're going through right now, that not only are there all of the political differences about how to interpret what's happening, but there are also actual medical conversations about what are the thresholds of safety and who gets this and which populations are most vulnerable and does it come back and how long does immunity last? Those things are still at least partly unresolved. Other questions that come up: with whom is it safe to eat? This is where a lot of the social reorganization comes up, is just around the matter of eating. How do we know that our food is safe? With whom is it safe to sleep? With whom is it safe to do business? How do those who remain healthy care for the most vulnerable? This is one of the central questions. And it's a question that's beautifully dealt with in Manzoni's I Promessi Sposi, the Betrothed, where the establishment of the lazarettos is a place where they're basically, people are disposed of there. They're just sent there to die. But the tenderness that the people in the religious orders exhibit toward those who are dying is one of the most powerful arguments I know of for palliative care and the place of palliative care in medicine. One of the questions that comes up in all of the stories is whether disease victims feel safe to identify themselves when they're at risk for doing so. And certainly this was right out front as a public question in the AIDS epidemic. If you acknowledged that you had AIDS, you were going to be quarantined, and there was a lot of political division over quarantining as an abridgment of civil rights. It's another question that comes up. And then there's just the big moral question of responsibility, which leads to the matter of blame. And blame is a big thing we're going to come back to in a minute. So epidemics always put us in a field of tension. We're all in it together, but self-preservation drives people into isolation and flight and sometimes aggressive antisocial behavior. So those are the two poles of the paradox. One of the purposes served by literary representations of the plague is not just to record all of this social disruption and its consequences, but often to issue a kind of political Jeremiad or a warning to the people. And this is certainly true of early accounts where the theology of God's punishment coming through plagues and epidemics was pretty widespread. So you see some pretty harsh material about what is being inflicted on the people by God. So you see many stories have accounts of masses of repentance or flagellants in the streets, or people in great fear that what we're witnessing is a kind of apocalyptic scene of punishment. And there's always blame. So I want to go to the blame. We all know that the Jews were blamed for poisoning the wells in the Black Death. That's a famous one. And the Jews have been blamed a lot because they have been a wandering outsider population in so many of these instances. And when you think about the ways in which Chinese are being blamed by some people in this epidemic. It's not quite as widespread, but it's certainly similar, that they brought it in. As soon as you can attach blame to a population, there's a certain kind of safety people find in that. So the great literature of plagues and epidemics focuses on that blame and on the consequences of blaming and scapegoating as a problem. The narrators will generally identify it as a serious social problem, but the people who are in it are just seeking safety in it. And basically, soldiers often brought it in. Foreigners sometimes did bring it in. The Black Death came to Europe from the East through ships in the ports at Naples. So it's not fanciful to think that foreigners have often been the source of outbreaks in particular locations. The more people move around, the more the pathogens are going to be transported. But during the epidemic of the Black Death, the persecution of the Jews broke out with even greater ferocity than during the Crusades in the 12th century. Some victim was needed to appease the populace. They were accused of poisoning the wells. They were accused of infecting the air. They were accused of painting contaminated substances on church pews and the walls of buildings. It really got pretty wild. I'm going to skip down a little bit here because I'm trying to be mindful about the time. Another common feature of this stories is a widening awareness. This is really interesting to watch. You track, the narrator tracks what dawns on people at what point in the process as things get worse and worse. Who remains in denial and how long denial lasts and who notices. And one example I want to give of that is in the opening chapters of Camus' novel, The Plague, which takes place in the city of Oran and in Algeria in 1940 something. He leaves a little blank after 194. But he wrote this in 1947, right after World War II. And in the opening chapters, we see a rat, I think probably on page 2 or 3, that Dr. Ryu comes out of his apartment onto the landing and he notices a rat. And then he goes downstairs and he says something to the concierge. And the concierge at the building says, yes, he's seen a few rats. And then he comes back later in the day and there are more rats. And then he sees rats in a trash can. And so other things are happening in the story, but the rats keep coming up. So of course there's a little dramatic irony in this, and the reader is thinking, okay, so when is somebody going to get it that these rats are a serious problem? And so this goes on for maybe the first couple of chapters, that people keep noticing the rats, and then they start talking about the rats. And you get a whole series of responses where people are explaining them away. Yeah, the rats are really a problem. Well, it must be the weather. Well, it's not a big deal. They'll go away. We've heard some of this, right? It'll go away. So the rats, but they don't go away. And so finally, somebody has to recognize that maybe the rats are connected to all the outbreaks of a disease that looks suspiciously like bubonic plague. But part of the fascination of the story is that whole matter of noticing. And in fact, I would venture to say that noticing is one of the great themes of at least the first chapters of that particular novel. In Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, which he based on his uncle's actual journal, but his rendering is a novel, the noticing comes up when people just begin to notice that the list of the people in the District of London who have died on the obituaries page is getting longer. It's such a funny little observation. But as people see the lists getting longer, they kind of have a choice point about whether to acknowledge that something big is happening or to explain it away. And when I'm working with students, I usually just try to have people check in about their own level of denial. Just when have you found yourself just deciding, you know, I don't really want to know that? Because if I know that, I'm going to have to do something about it. I remember a conversation with one woman who was talking about factory farms, and she said, I was ranting on a little bit about what goes on in factory farms. And if you're going to eat meat, you really need to know where it comes from and what are the costs of it. And she said, I just don't want to know this. I just want to eat my meat. But I don't want to know this. It's such an interesting piece of both the rendering of these stories by their writers, the work of the narrator in the story, and also the ways in which readers have to come to terms with themselves, especially in stories that go on for sometimes paragraphs or pages detailing pretty horrific events or grisly bodily manifestations and detailed depictions. For instance, in Richard Preston's The Hot Zone, he has, I think, something like a 4-page description of what happens to the body when in an Ebola victim. And I remember he did a reading at a church adult ed hour last time, and he chose to read that passage. And afterwards, the first question was, why did you choose to read us that? And he just laughed and he said, because this is where these stories take us. And one of the questions the stories always bring up is, what are you willing to know? Are you willing to look at this? What are you willing to notice? Where's your threshold of willingness to be aware or to connect the dots or to acknowledge that something has to shift in our own behavior? Denial is a huge theme in these stories. Another plague story I hadn't mentioned is Jack London's The Scarlet Plague, which was written in 1913. And I see one person had a flash of recognition there, that it was written in 1913. It takes place in 2073. It's a futuristic dystopian novel about a great pandemic that happens in 2013. So the narrator is an old man who lived through the Great Plague of 2013, as London is imagining it in 1913. And it has pretty much decimated Western civilization. Well, to my great amusement, it takes place in Berkeley, which is where I've lived for a good part of my life. So it all looks like local history to me, and some of it takes place on Berkeley campus. And the professors, bless their hearts, all sequester themselves in the chemistry building. They sort of barricade it and keep people out. But so the old man tells the story, and I'm going to just read you, I think I have time to read you a short passage here from that story. He says, word came of a strange disease that had broken out in New York. Nobody thought anything about the news. It was only a small thing. There had been only a few deaths. It seemed, though, that they had died very quickly, and that one of the first signs of the disease was the turning red of the face and all the body. Within 24 hours came the report of the first case in Chicago. And on the same day, it was made public that London, the greatest city in the world next to Chicago, had been secretly fighting the plague for 2 weeks and censoring the news dispatches, that is, not permitting the word to go forth to the rest of the world that London had the plague. It looked serious, but we in California, like everywhere else, were not alarmed. We were sure that the bacteriologists would find a way to overcome this new germ, just as they had overcome other germs in the past. I just thought I'd read that because it has a certain amusement value, since it sounds awfully familiar given the moment that we're in. I think what I want to skip to now is just the fact, which of course is near to my heart, that one of the things that changes in situations of pandemics is language itself. There's a naming and a renaming, and we come to recognize that what we call it matters. It matters, first of all, whether we call it an epidemic or a pandemic. That's significant distinction. But speech itself changes and language itself becomes a casualty, as it does in war. This again is a little quote from London. He says about the people who were left after the plague, after this great pandemic, their language began to break down. They no longer had a cultural conversation in which they were full participants. And he says, the survivors spoke in monosyllables and short, jerky sentences that was more a gibberish than a language. And yet through it ran hints of grammatical construction and appeared vestiges of the conjugation of some superior culture. Even the speech of grandsire, this old man who's telling the story, was so corrupt that were it put down literally, it would be almost so much nonsense to the reader. Well, one of the ways in which language degenerates is that slogans catch on, and this happens in political language too. And that people reduce things to a kind of manageable shorthand. Again, it's a kind of way of seeking safety. And then one of the language features that I think is important in this pandemic that we're in, as in so many, is the way in which the war metaphor becomes a dominant metaphor. War against disease becomes a holy war. And religious and military and medical language start to interpenetrate, and they're used interchangeably in some ways that are convenient but deceptive. This way of imagining what's happening can really quickly go beyond useful analogy to dangerous confusion of moral, political, legal, and medical issues. And it can heighten the potential for serious injustice. It's so easy to forget when we're even using metaphors. And I think that's especially true of the military metaphors in medicine, which have come up for intelligent examination by a lot of people in recent years. But when you think about how we've had wars on cancer and war on drugs, and how we encourage people to be fighters when they develop a serious illness, and how we bombard things with antibiotics and we take aggressive measures, all of that military language is not absolutely peculiar to the US, but as I understand it from my reading, it's most dominant in American medicine. It's a country that spends 62% of its national budget on the military. So it's not surprising that we also allow military metaphors to infuse the business of healing. But isn't that ironic that the language we have for healing is the language of warfare? I love telling a story that I got from a book a friend of mine wrote called Reconstructing Illness, about a young man who went to his doctor, his oncologist, when he found he had cancer. And the oncologist was using all this military language about how, well, we're really going to fight this, and I'm sure you're a fighter and we'll defeat it. And finally, the young man said, I've been a Quaker all my life. I'm not a fighter. I don't even want to be a fighter. I'm a committed pacifist. And it's not helpful for me to think about my body as a battleground. So could we find a different way to talk about this? And to his credit, the oncologist sat down with them and said, okay. And they ended up deciding that they would talk about the illness as a journey. And the shift of metaphor made so much difference. And so I think it's really important in the moment that we're in to think about what's happening to language and about how we talk about what we are involved in, about borrowing tropes from apocalyptic literature, about how we identify those who are suffering, how we talk about people in whole populations, how easy it is to lose perspective on the magnitude of what's happening, but also on the intensity of individual suffering. If we see statistics, as we do every day, today it's over 225,000 deaths in the US. And every morning we hear those numbers on the news, but statistics, they're important to help us get the scope. But getting from the statistic back to the fact of one death and to the fact of what it is for someone to witness a death, especially for those of us who have been tucked up in fairly comfortable suburban houses and don't know too many people who have gotten sick. Just getting a sense of the reality of what is among us, let alone within us, really takes a sustained collective act of imagination. So some of the problems that come up in public narratives, and I'll stop here. Melissa, is it time for me to stop? Yes? Almost.
You have a few more minutes. You can definitely offer concluding comments. You're doing great.
Okay, so here's some concluding comments. I think as we look at the stories that have been told about other plagues and epidemics, I think it's really important to look at some of the problems that are coming up in the public narratives that we're witnessing now and the stories that people are telling, some of which are very helpful. But it's important to scan for inaccuracies. Just what are the facts? Who's hyperbolizing? Where are the exaggerations for effect? Where are the warnings? Who's writing things in all caps, for instance, in their daily emails? Where are the rationalizations? The rationalizations for early neglect, the rationalizations for attributions of false causes, people covering their evasions or lies or something, and that becomes part of the narrative. The rationalization does. Conspiracy theories always come up. And I believe that there are conspiracies. People do conspire. On the other hand, and I think it's unfortunate that conspiracy theory has become a term of dismissal or term of dismissiveness, because it makes us that much less able to actually register when there has possibly been a conspiracy that we need to take seriously. On the other hand, really wild conspiracy theories, as we know, come up. Somebody planted it. It's a form of biowarfare, and so on. We've witnessed some of those recently. The blame I've already mentioned. The rhetorical trappings of rational analysis can cover over a great deal. The identification of turning points. We're at a peak. We're rounding a corner. We're at the nadir of this. Just sort of all the graphs and the ways in which people are mapping the events, when in fact there's so much indeterminacy about the length or the outcome. That's a really interesting feature, that once you're in a narrative, you want to bring that narrative to closure. And so narrative pressure starts to build. Eyewitness accounts are often competitive, and apocryphal science tends to produce its own narratives that become embedded. So, and framing it as an economic threat, for instance, and making it about the economy means it's not about something else. So what is this about is a really interesting question that shifts in the course of trying to construct a story about an epidemic. And then finally we get these theological legitimations and what's going on in pulpits, and a lot of story making among people in churches who are weaving the events into a kind of homemade theology. But it's certainly a time when the church needs theologians and people who understand the God's mysterious ways. They understand how much theology has to acknowledge what we don't know and can't know. And how are we to pray? There are many very interesting prayers that have been written for the public in times of plague. And those prayers also have a literary dimension that's worth looking at. What words do you choose? So I'm just going to end, if I may, by reading you this poem called Pandemic, speaking of choosing words. This is by the Berkeley poet Lynn Unger, and it was written on March 11th of this year. What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down, And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has come clear. Do not reach out your hands. Reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
Thank you, Marilyn. That was a beautiful way to connect us all in that ending poem reading. So thank you for that. We do have a few questions, a couple that have come in from the chat and a couple that have been actually pre-submitted when people registered. So I want to start, just invite you, if you have a lingering question or you want Marilyn to speak further on something she mentioned, a particular theme, now would be a great time to put that into the chat. If you'd like to ask something anonymously, you can actually select to just send me your question to the name Upper House, and I'll be the only one who can see that if that's what you'd prefer. So Marilyn, someone asked, are there reasons for the cyclical nature of the plagues and epidemics? Population growth, economic reasons, social mobility. Can you comment on the cyclical nature that you've seen across time?
Yeah, I don't know that I would call it cyclical. It's certainly recurrent. And as I understand it, just from looking at a timeline of plagues and epidemics in Western history and in world history, there are several of them every century. And so kind of the bubonic plague was one of the big ones that kept recurring. And then as that receded, cholera, typhus, influenza, these kind of have their rising and falling. And I think that some of the reasons for recurrence have to do certainly with human mobility. And these days they have to do with the intersection between human activity and the natural world. As we tear down rainforests, new viruses emerge from the rainforest that then seek human hosts, and those human hosts go to new places. And so, even this question of transmission becomes very interesting because we're dealing now with viruses that we don't really know all their properties. As I recall, Fauci said recently that he's spent his whole career with infectious diseases and viruses, and he's never seen one that has this many different ways of behaving. So, but I think that when we talk about the cyclical nature, it's just that I've always found this fascinating about epidemiology, that epidemics have a kind of curve, and they peter out when enough people have been, this whole matter of herd immunity is that when enough people have been infected and they don't have enough hosts, they go underground, but we don't know when they're going to reemerge. And so I think they reemerge when a new vulnerable population is available. But you get a much better explanation from an epidemiologist.
Next question is, what are some of the dominant theories that have impeded effective responses to plagues in modern times?
Well, interestingly, I saw a piece recently about germ theory itself and how germ theory, the microbes that we understand bacteria and viruses, although I think that there's still a lot of popular confusion about bacteria as opposed to viruses and how we treat them and what they do. But germ theory also tends to obscure or sometimes exclude the kind of ecological understanding of, well, both disease with respect to ecological shifts and often human destruction or management of habitat, but also chemical, environmental chemicals, and how many sensitivities to chemicals play into the diseases that we're experiencing. So there's the kind of macro level of explanation, and there's the micro level of explanation for what goes on in the body, the single body, and then what goes on in, as it were, the body politic. And those are kind of two different stories. So I think that's interesting. Again, it comes back to this matter of where do you situate yourself in order to say what's happening? What's happening is a really complicated question. Yeah.
A different question. Can you comment on how news or information and the filtering of news come into play in a pandemic?
Oh, yes. Well, that's that's one of the things we come back to a lot in this course that I teach is what are the stories you're seeing now? And one of the problems we see now, of course, is the nature of the media in a capitalistic culture where the media are owned by people with vested interests and independent media are largely underfunded. And so how do you get reliable information has become a much more vexed question than I think it probably was 50 years ago even. But um, the role of the media certainly is to inform the public. There's a book, I borrowed one of my book titles or stole it partly from a book by Paul Weaver, who used to write for The Economist, who published a book in 1995 called News and the Culture of Lies. And he said in the beginning of that, you would think from the title that I'm going to talk about bad journalism, but actually I'm going to talk about what passes for good journalism. And just looking at how what we have learned to tolerate in journalism. If you go online and you look at the standard for journalistic ethics that I think is put out by a national organization of journalists, they're very high standards, but it's hard to hold the media accountable. So right now, I think that what we need to be doing as intelligent consumers of information is build circles of trust who really count on people who can count on each other to do some of the homework, the deep dive into multiple reasonable media sources, and some of them independent and some of them state funded, and just kind of track the experts, track the money, say, where's this information coming from? It's kind of like tracking where your food is coming from. I don't think we used to have to be quite as conscientious shoppers either. But now we're in this environment of pesticides and factory farms, and we really have to look at food and the food system we're in differently. So I think there's a pretty close analogy to the way in which we have to look at the media the discursive environment we inhabit, and take a long critical look at, and begin to notice some of the hallmarks of cheap, quick, sensationalistic journalism as opposed to thoughtful, reflective journalism. And one of those hallmarks for me is how much are they willing to deal in ambiguity? Because the ambiguities are with us. And if they're driving to an answer too quickly, that's a pretty good sign that it's superficial information.
Let's see. You spoke about language towards the end. Someone asked, how have memories of ancient plagues and diseases been preserved as metaphors in language and culture?
A plague on both your houses, a pox on him. Yeah, I think you see a lot of it in Shakespeare, actually. And most of Shakespeare's life, he was in a period of the plague. So that's what immediately occurred to me with how it makes its way into those kind of curses. And certainly during the AIDS epidemic, the word plague was appropriated by people who wrote from within gay communities that were heavily affected by the plague, that they would call it the plague. One of the first novels to come out of the AIDS epidemic was a novel called Plague by Toby Johnson. That was a really interesting one where he looks at how people are connected all over the country. And the novel itself works like a kind of epidemiological map where they're looking for patient zero, if you remember that term. but I think there's been a lot of conversation about the word victim and whether you should use victim to describe people who have the disease. Um, there, there are ways of talking about whole populations, but I'm having a hard time coming up with really good examples. But I think if we just listen for them and start watching for them, you'll see how this is epidemic. Epidemic itself has become a metaphor, and it's applied to many things that aren't epidemics and aren't even diseases.
Mm.
So, I think that one of the things that happens is that medical language becomes popularized and then becomes used very loosely, and then it becomes it's used metaphorically, and it's used colloquially, and so that's sort of a lineage.
Yeah, that's something to pay attention to. So before I ask our final question, I want to let everyone know that for those who want to actually continue this conversation, you're invited to join us immediately following this event for 30 minutes of extended Q&A. Perhaps you'll be able to ask your question directly to Marilyn, depending upon how many of us are in the room. And there's a Zoom meeting link for that directly in your chat, and it was also in your email reminder today. And also, I want to let you know and give a thank you to Erdman's Publishers is offering all of you a 40% discount on all of Marilyn's books for the next 30 days by using the code UHouse40 when you make a purchase on erdmans.christianbook.com. So for any of Marilyn's books, the next 30 days, if you want to buy a gift or check out some of Marilyn's amazing writing, that information is in the chat. But Marilyn, as we close, I would love to kind of go back to something you said at the beginning. You said that plagues reveal something that we all need to see. And so I wonder what your reflection is about people of faith in this moment in time, about the church and how we relate to our communities as believers. And perhaps you have an exhortation or a thought of a way that we could create the narrative in this moment based on what's being revealed, based on history and what's happened before, but what's the opportunity we have in this moment as Christ followers to be faithful and to engage and to show the love of Christ in this moment?
Thank you for that. It's a good way to end. I think one of the messages that we really need to internalize at a moment like this is that we are all in it together. We are all human beings that have been put on this planet, on this journey, in the same state of vulnerability and need. It's a time for a real reflection on humility, the root word of which is humus, the soil. We are made of this earth. And I think that it's a good time to, since we are looking at the pandemic and at climate change as two crises that are facing us in the news, it's a good time to connect those dots and to say that there's something in the way we care for our bodies and for each other that needs to extend to how we care for the planet itself. I love the prayer in the Episcopal Church that has the phrase in it, "This fragile earth, our island home." We pray for this fragile earth, our island home. And so we live in this home together. And I think the fact that we are brothers and sisters and that we're in one body, we can reclaim those body metaphors in new ways when so many bodies are becoming sick and dying. Our vulnerability is something to really reflect on together. And that we are being held and cared for and accompanied on this journey.
Thank you so much. It was such an honor to host you here at Upper House, not physically, but virtually today. Thank you to all who gathered with us for sharing your time with us. We hope that you were informed and encouraged today. And anyone who wants to join us, Marilyn and I will be going over to Afterwards with Marilyn for extended Q&A. The rest of you have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.